We are very close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers, but I still need your support. Please don't forget to take a second and subscribe to my channel. The last bus of the night was due at 10:12 p.m. on January 18, 1999, a Monday that had begun with lake-effect snow warnings and ended beneath a sky the color of ash. In downtown Lansing, the temperature had dropped to 9 degrees, the kind of cold that stiffened eyelids and froze the air inside nostrils. Janet Whitaker, 32 years old, high school English teacher, known for her punctuality and her habit of humming old Motown songs when she graded essays, stood under the flickering sodium street lamp beside the Route 7 bus stop on Harrison Avenue. She was bundled in her dark wool coat, red scarf looped twice around her neck, gloved hands clutching a canvas tote filled with ungraded essays and an empty Tupperware container from her lunch. The sidewalks were empty, the snow falling thick and fast enough to blur the outlines of cars parked along the curb. Behind her, the windows of the Mapleview apartments glowed dimly, silhouettes moving occasionally against drawn curtains. Across the street, the municipal snowplow yard loomed silent, its chain-link fence rimmed with ice, plow blades lined in neat rows like rusted jaws, waiting to devour another winter storm. Janet had taken this bus almost every night for 3 years, ever since her Honda Civic's transmission failed, and she decided to save for a new car instead of paying for repairs. Her colleagues often teased her for trusting public transit in Michigan winters, but she liked the predictability of the schedule, the small community of regular riders, and the quiet minutes between school and home. Her mother, Lorraine, had called earlier that evening to warn her about the blizzard forecast. "You should have someone drive you, Jan," she'd said, "or stay with a friend." Janet had laughed softly, reassuring her that she'd be fine, that the bus never failed her, and that she actually liked the stillness of snow before everything turned to slush. The bus never came. At least that's what the Transit Authority records would later show. Route 7's last scheduled trip was canceled at 9:45 p.m. due to whiteout conditions, a decision radioed to all drivers but never updated on the public timetable. Somewhere between the dispatch office and the frozen bus stop, communication failed. At 10:27 p.m., a man named Arthur Bell, who worked night security at the auto parts warehouse 3 blocks away, finished his cigarette break behind the loading dock and noticed something strange through the swirling snow. Across the intersection, under the yellow streetlight, he saw a woman standing alone at the bus stop, her red scarf bright against the white storm. Beside her, idling at the curb, was a white city maintenance truck with the Lansing Public Works insignia barely visible through frost on the door. Bell assumed the driver was offering her a ride out of the cold, a kindness common among city workers during bad weather. He went back inside, poured himself coffee, and by the time he looked out again 10 minutes later, both woman and truck were gone. The next morning, when snowplows cleared Harrison Avenue, they found Janet's tote bag partially buried near the bus stop bench. Inside were 38 essays, a pen with the cap missing, and her wallet still zipped inside a small inner pocket. There were no footprints beyond those of the cleanup crew, no signs of struggle, no tire tracks distinguishable among the layered snow. The discovery triggered a missing person report that would quietly evolve into one of Lansing's most baffling cold cases. Detective Mark Hensley, 41, assigned to the case, was a pragmatic investigator who'd seen his share of winter tragedies. Cars found in ditches days after a blizzard, elderly residents succumbing to carbon monoxide poisoning during power outages, but the bus stop scene unsettled him. The absence of physical evidence wasn't just inconvenient, it felt orchestrated. The snow had fallen heavily until around 2 a.m., effectively erasing any trace of what might have happened between 10:15 and 10:30. By sunrise, the world had reset, clean and silent, the kind of morning that made the city look deceptively peaceful. Janet's disappearance came to light when she failed to show up for homeroom attendance the next day. Her students assumed she'd taken a sick day. The principal tried calling her home number. No answer. By afternoon, when Lorraine Whitaker arrived at the school, pale and trembling, saying Janet hadn't come home or called, the reality began to take shape. Hensley visited Janet's apartment that evening. The front door was locked. Her car sat buried under snow in its usual space. Inside, lights were off, dishes rinsed and stacked, the thermostat set to 68. A coffee mug sat half full on the counter, ringed with cold residue. On the kitchen table, a half-finished crossword puzzle lay beside a copy of Wuthering Heights open to chapter 32. Nothing indicated sudden departure or distress. The apartment smelled faintly of vanilla candles and detergent. Hensley noted that the answering machine held one new message, her mother's voice from 9:12 p.m., telling her to call when she got home. Lorraine listened to the playback twice before covering her mouth and whispering that her daughter would never just leave. Over the following days, Lansing police canvassed the area, checking with snowplow drivers and municipal workers. Every city maintenance truck was accounted for except one, Unit 342, assigned to the West Side Salt route. According to Public Works records, its driver, a 58-year-old employee named Leonard Pierce, had called in sick that morning. The truck was listed as parked in the depot lot all night, but when Hensley and his partner visited the yard, they found snow patterns inconsistent with that claim. The tire tracks around the vehicle were fresher than those of adjacent trucks, suggesting it had moved sometime during the night and returned before dawn. The engine block was still faintly warm beneath the hood, despite temperatures that should have cooled it hours earlier. Hensley ordered forensic testing on the tires and undercarriage, but the snow and road salt had stripped away anything useful. When questioned, Pierce insisted he'd been home all evening with the flu. His wife confirmed the story. He seemed genuinely confused by the implication that his truck had been used without authorization. "Keys stay in the office lockbox," he told detectives. Anyone with clearance could have taken it. Security cameras at the yard offered no help. The one facing the parking area had been malfunctioning since December, and budget cuts meant the replacement request had never been approved. Hensley's gut told him this wasn't random. Someone with access to municipal property, someone who understood the city's blind spots, had approached Janet Whitaker that night. Over the next week, as snow continued to fall and local media latched onto the story of the teacher who vanished in the storm, search teams combed bus routes, drainage ditches, and abandoned lots. Dogs lost the scent within yards of the bus stop. Divers probed the frozen Grand River with sonar, finding nothing but discarded bicycles and shopping carts. Forensic teams tested Janet's tote bag, recovering partial fingerprints matching her own and smudged impressions that could belong to anyone. Each dead end deepened the mystery. By February, Hensley's office walls were plastered with maps of Lansing bus routes, shift schedules for city maintenance crews, and photographs of Janet smiling with her students during a fall field trip. The case file grew thicker but not deeper. The bus stop had become a landmark of unease. Residents crossed the street to avoid it. Parents warned children not to linger there after dark. Lorraine Whitaker appeared on local news, holding her daughter's photo in trembling hands, pleading for information. Her voice cracked on the words, "Please don't forget her." For weeks no one did. Then the next winter came, and the silence returned heavier than the snow itself. By late February 1999, the posters with Janet Whitaker's photo had begun to curl at the corners where tape met frozen brick. The snowbanks along Harrison Avenue were gray now, crusted with salt and exhaust. The city's attempt to return to normal grinding forward, even as residents whispered about what might have happened to the teacher who vanished waiting for a bus that never came. Detective Mark Hensley still drove that stretch every night before heading home, his cruiser's heater rattling, radio turned low to police dispatch static. He always slowed at the bus stop, headlights sweeping across the bench, the streetlight, the darkened fence of the municipal yard beyond. Sometimes he imagined he saw movement, a shadow, a reflection, but it was only wind pushing through unplowed drifts. The case file on his passenger seat had grown thick with typed reports and handwritten notes that led nowhere. The absence of evidence was beginning to feel deliberate, as though someone had studied what snow could erase and built an entire plan around it. The city maintenance department cooperated outwardly, but grew defensive under questioning. Leonard Pierce, the driver whose truck had supposedly been idle, called in sick again for 3 consecutive days after Hensley's initial visit. His wife told investigators he was under stress, not sleeping, replaying old nightmares from his years plowing roads during fatal accidents. When Pierce finally agreed to a follow-up interview, he looked thinner, hollowed by anxiety. He swore he hadn't taken the truck, that maybe a co-worker had borrowed it without logging the keys. He mentioned a mechanic named Donnie Brewer who often worked late and might have moved vehicles for maintenance. But Brewer was found dead 2 weeks later of an apparent heart attack in his apartment, sitting in a recliner before a muted television, snow still melting from his boots. Toxicology. would later suggest a massive dose of prescription sedatives. The coroner called it accidental overdose. Hensley wasn't convinced. By March, the cold case unit from the Michigan State Police offered limited assistance. They brought in a forensic meteorologist to reconstruct the night's conditions. His analysis concluded that any tire or foot impressions made before 10:30 p.m. would have been completely buried within an hour, meaning whoever approached Janet had the perfect environmental cover. The scientist's tone was clinical, detached, but to Hensley it sounded like an admission of hopelessness. Still, he re-interviewed Arthur Bell, the night security guard whose sighting of the maintenance truck remained the only external witness. Bell's recollection had not changed. A woman in a red scarf, a white truck idling, no sign of struggle. Under gentle questioning, Bell added one new detail. He thought he saw a flicker of blue light on the truck's dashboard, maybe a police scanner or two-way radio. The municipal trucks didn't carry those. Hensley began tracing city maintenance keys, compiling a log of who had access to the depot. The list was long: 34 employees, 5 supervisors, 2 night watchmen, and contracted mechanics. One name caught his attention: a temporary hire named Raymond Nash, 45, employed seasonally during winter plow shifts. Nash had been terminated on January 20th, 2 days after Janet's disappearance, for attendance issues and insubordination. His file listed prior misdemeanors for trespassing and petty theft, but nothing violent. When Hensley visited the address on Nash's application, he found an abandoned duplex, windows boarded, mailbox stuffed with flyers. A neighbor said the man had left town suddenly, right after that teacher went missing, loading his old pickup with boxes before dawn. The plates traced to a vehicle later impounded in Indiana for unpaid tickets, but Nash himself was gone. Meanwhile, the local press seized on every fragment. The Lansing Herald ran headlines like "Teacher Vanishes," "Snow Holds Secrets," and "Ghost Bus on Route 7. Talk radio speculated about serial abductions, government cover-ups, or aliens, theories that irritated investigators but kept public attention alive. Janet Whitaker clung to that attention. She appeared on morning shows holding her daughter's favorite scarf, recounting Janet's kindness and routine, her devotion to students, her fear of driving in icy conditions. Donations trickled in to fund private searches. Volunteers fanned out across the city with metal detectors and borrowed drones once the thaw began, combing drainage canals and vacant lots. They found discarded clothing, a frozen dog carcass, and at one point a human femur that turned out to belong to a long-missing transient. Nothing of Janet. In April, a tip arrived from a maintenance supervisor named Chris Gentry. He reported finding a pair of work gloves wedged behind a fuel drum in the depot's storage shed. They were standard issue but oddly stiff, as if exposed to moisture and cold. Forensics detected faint traces of blood and a single dark hair. DNA testing was still slow in 1999, but results came back weeks later. Female, partial profile, consistent with Janet's mother's reference sample. It wasn't definitive proof, but it reignited the investigation. Hensley confronted Leonard Pierce again, asking who had access to that shed. Pierce's answer was evasive. "Everyone," he said, "but nobody goes near that drum unless they're looking for trouble." When Hensley pressed, Pierce admitted that during night storms, some drivers met there to rest or warm up, sometimes drinking coffee spiked with whiskey, sometimes sleeping in their trucks until sunrise. There were no logs, no supervision, only a padlock that rarely closed properly. A week later, Pierce disappeared. His wife reported him missing after finding his truck gone and his wallet on the kitchen counter. The city assumed he'd fled under suspicion, but his body surfaced 3 days later in the Grand River near a frozen culvert, face pale as porcelain, lungs filled with water and antifreeze. The medical examiner ruled it suicide. Hensley read the report twice, then closed his office door and sat staring at the wall map. If Pierce had been guilty, why drown himself with chemicals not easily available to civilians? If he'd been innocent, why run? The pattern forming in Hensley's mind felt too neat, like someone tying off loose ends. By summer, the case went cold officially, though unofficially Hensley refused to file it away. He transferred to the homicide division later that year, but kept Janet's folder on his desk, reopening it whenever new technology or tips promised a breakthrough. Over the next decade, the Whitaker case became a local legend. Bus drivers told new hires about the haunted stop on Harrison Avenue. High schoolers dared each other to stand there at midnight when the temperature dropped below 10 degrees. Some claimed they heard humming, soft, rhythmic, like a woman singing under her breath. Others swore they saw a white maintenance truck drive by slowly and vanish at the intersection, tires leaving no tracks. In 2005, a retired public works employee named Tom Iverson contacted Hensley saying guilt had been gnawing at him. They met in a diner off I-96. Iverson, now 71, ordered black coffee and wouldn't look up from the cup. He said that during the winter of 1989, there had been unregistered overtime slips, extra pay hours logged under fake names. The department supervisor, a man named Gerald Pope, had run an off-book side business renting city equipment to private contractors for cash. If a truck left the yard that night, Iverson said, it might have been one of Pope's deals gone bad. He refused to elaborate further, muttering that some people still working in the department didn't like questions. 2 months later, Iverson died of a heart attack while shoveling snow. The next credible lead arrived in 2010 when road reconstruction unearthed a sealed maintenance drain 3 blocks from Harrison Avenue. Workers found an old key ring inside wrapped in decayed leather. Forensics identified 2 keys, one matching a Mapleview Apartments unit, the other a generic city utility padlock. Lorraine confirmed the apartment key was Janet's. There were no fingerprints, no blood, just rust and grime. The discovery reignited media coverage. Reporters swarmed the bus stop again, interviewing Lorraine, now grayer, slower, still calling her daughter's name into microphones that transmitted hope into static. By 2014, technology finally caught up. The DNA from the blood on those gloves, preserved in evidence for 15 years, yielded a full profile through advanced sequencing. The match came not from the national database but from a private genealogical site. The sample linked to a family name, Nash. Raymond Nash, the seasonal worker who vanished days after the disappearance. A search of digital archives revealed he'd been arrested in 2003 under an alias for vagrancy in Toledo, then released. His trail ended there. Hensley, now nearing retirement, partnered with younger detectives to trace relatives. They found a sister in Florida who admitted Ray had sent letters for years, rambling notes about voices in the snow and a girl who wouldn't get in the truck. The letters stopped in 2004. In 2016, a hunter discovered skeletal remains in a wooded drainage area south of Lansing, partially exposed by spring thaw. Forensics confirmed through dental records that it was Raymond Nash. He'd died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Near the remains was a rusted maintenance badge and an empty bottle of antifreeze. Inside a sealed plastic folder buried beneath him lay 3 Polaroid photos, water-damaged but partially legible. One showed the Harrison Avenue bus stop under snowfall. Another depicted a pair of gloves on a bench. The third, most haunting, captured the blurred outline of a woman's face in the truck's side mirror, red scarf bright against darkness. The photo's timestamp read 10:18 p.m., January 18, 1999. Forensic analysis confirmed the mirror's curvature matched the city's Unit 342 truck. Hensley stared at the evidence table for a long time after that, realizing the circle had closed. The maintenance worker who shouldn't have been on duty, the truck that wasn't logged, the witness who saw kindness instead of threat. All threads converging in one night of snow. Nash had likely offered Janet a ride, panicked when she resisted, struck her, and disposed of her body in a site never recovered. The antifreeze on Pierce's body now seemed less suicide than staged warning. Someone had ensured silence long after Nash fled. Lorraine Whitaker received the news with the calm of exhaustion rather than relief. She told reporters she'd always believed her daughter's last moments were cold but quick. When they asked if she forgave the man responsible, she said she didn't need to. He'd already punished himself. The city renamed the bus stop Memorial Corner, installing a plaque that read, "In memory of those who wait in the storm." Every January, fresh red scarves appear on the bench, tied there by anonymous hands fluttering against the Michigan wind like signals between the living and the lost. By 2019, the Harrison Avenue bus stop no longer looked like the place where a woman had vanished. The city had replaced the old sodium lamp with an LED fixture that burned bluish-white and installed a shelter with plexiglass walls to meet updated accessibility codes. Commuters came and went each morning, checking their phones, stamping snow from their boots, never noticing the faint discoloration in the concrete where the plaque had been reset after vandalism. 20 years had passed since that January night, and most of the original investigators were retired or dead. But the file labeled Whitaker, Janet L. still occupied a shelf in the Gratiot County Cold Case Archive, its edges frayed from handling, its contents swollen by decades of supplemental reports that collectively told a story without an ending. Detective Clara Jensen discovered it by accident while auditing the department's evidence inventory. At 35, she was too young to remember the case when it happened, but old enough to appreciate the hold it still had on the community. Her mother had been one of Janet's students at Lansing East High, and when Jensen mentioned the file at Sunday dinner, her mother's face tightened. "That teacher," she said softly. "The one who hummed in class." We left candles for her on the steps. Jensen decided to reopen the case unofficially, just to see what 21st century forensics could make of 20th century mysteries. She began by requesting a digital transfer of all physical evidence stored under the original case number. The property room clerk wheeled out 2 cardboard boxes sealed with brittle evidence tape. Inside were the tote bag, the work gloves, fragments of keychain leather, and a half-melted disposable lighter recovered near the drainage culvert in 2000. Technology had advanced beyond anything Hensley could have imagined. Using vapor phase extraction and isotope profiling, the state lab detected trace compounds on the tote fabric. Glycol ether residues consistent with industrial de-icer, but also a compound found in hydraulic fluid used exclusively in municipal maintenance vehicles built before 1995. That detail seemed trivial, until Jensen cross-referenced it with fleet maintenance logs. Unit 342, the truck connected to the case, had been retired in 2001 and auctioned to a private salvage yard. She tracked it to a rural property outside Eaton Rapids, now owned by a scrap dealer named Hal Curtis. Curtis remembered the truck immediately. White Chevy, city decal half scraped off. "Bought it at auction for parts," he told her, leading the detective through a maze of rusting vehicles. The cab sat under a corrugated metal roof, doors missing, dashboard stripped, but the frame remained intact. Jensen ran her gloved hand across the interior metal and noticed something that made her pulse quicken. Faint etchings carved into the passenger door panel, obscured by grime. Under light, they resolved into 3 letters and 2 numbers. JLW 119. Janet Lynn Whitaker. January 19th. Someone had carved the initials and date from the inside. The direction of the stroke suggested they were made by the driver or someone seated in the cab, not by a captive. Forensics later confirmed the carvings were made with a small, blunt object, likely a maintenance key. The implication was chilling. Whoever drove the truck wanted to mark the event, memorialize it in a language only they understood. Jensen ordered luminol testing on the cab despite the vehicle's age and exposure. Under UV light, faint specks on the passenger footwell glowed blue, microscopic blood residues long dried but preserved in paint seams. DNA amplification produced a full female profile matching Janet Whitaker's mitochondrial sequence. After 2 decades, the case that had haunted Lansing finally had its first incontrovertible proof she had been inside that truck. The finding should have brought satisfaction, but instead it opened a deeper void. If Janet's body was never recovered, where had she gone after the truck stopped running? And why had Nash, the seasonal worker, killed himself years later with the truck's badge and a bottle of antifreeze buried beside him? Detective Jensen requested the old internal affairs records from the Department of Public Works, suspecting a larger pattern. Buried in microfilm archives, she found an anonymous letter dated March 1999, mailed to the mayor's office, warning that certain supervisors were using city equipment for after-hours contracts and that a young woman's accident would soon bring everything to light. The letter was unsigned but postmarked from Grand Ledge, where Gerald Pope, the department head, had owned a cabin. No follow-up investigation was documented. Jensen drove to the cabin site, now sold to a developer, but county records listed Pope's death in 2002 from a car crash on icy roads, a case Hensley himself had reviewed and deemed accidental. The file photo of the wreck showed Pope's sedan crushed against a tree, trunk filled with empty antifreeze jugs. The echo of that detail chilled Jensen. It seemed the antifreeze motif, the suicides, the chemical traces, had threaded through the story like a signature. Jensen located Pope's surviving son, Daniel, now a middle-aged HVAC technician living in Bay City. Over black coffee in a diner, he admitted his father had been mixed up in side jobs during the late 90s. He ran crews after hours, paid cash, said it was for private snow removal, Daniel recalled. But sometimes he'd come home smelling like paint thinner or something burnt. Said he was cleaning up spills. Mom thought it was just de-icer. When Jensen showed him the carved door photo, his hand trembled slightly. Dad had a thing about initials, he murmured. He'd etch ours into tools so nobody could steal them. JLW, he might have done that himself, like a mark, not a signature. The theory twisted the timeline. If Pope, not Nash, had driven the truck, Nash's disappearance could have been forced. A scapegoat's erasure. For months, Jensen sifted through employment records, payroll stubs, even old union grievances. She discovered that on January 19th, the day after Janet vanished, a work order logged an emergency salt delivery to a private warehouse owned by Northline Chemical. A contractor later fined for illegal dumping of industrial solvents. The order bore Pope's signature, but listed Nash as driver. No documentation of what was delivered or where it was stored survived. The chemical listed, ethylene glycol compound, the primary component of antifreeze, reappeared in every toxicology report connected to the case. The pattern was no coincidence. In September 2019, Jensen secured a warrant to search the defunct Northline property. Beneath layers of dust and old drums, she found a locked cold storage bay. When opened, the air reeked of corrosion and decay. Inside lay a collapsed tarp wrapped around degraded fabric, the remains of a dark wool coat and a red scarf turned brown with age. Forensic teams worked for weeks recovering bone fragments, a wristwatch, and a rusted locket containing a faded photograph of Janet Whitaker holding her infant daughter. Dental comparison confirmed what Lansing had waited 20 years to hear. The remains belonged to Janet. The body had been submerged in a tank of glycol solution, chemically preserved until the facility shut down. The cause of death? Blunt force trauma to the skull. The discovery tore open the city's collective memory. News outlets replayed archival footage of Lorraine begging for answers, of Hensley trudging through snow, of the bus stop glistening under police lights. Lorraine, now 78 and wheelchair-bound, appeared once more before cameras. Her voice was faint but steady. "I can finally bring my girl home," she said. But somebody put her there and thought time would make her disappear. Time doesn't forgive. Jensen's final step was connecting the chain of responsibility. A forensic accountant traced payments from Northline Chemical to a shell company registered under Pope's name, used to bill the city for emergency environmental services. Bank records showed 2 withdrawals in January 1999, totaling $15,000. Deposited into an account later closed after his death. Nash's employment file contained matching cash bonuses initialed GP. The implication was simple and damning. Pope had used city trucks and workers for illegal waste disposal. Janet Whitaker, waiting at the bus stop across from the depot, had likely seen something, or someone, she wasn't meant to. Maybe she noticed the truck leave the yard after hours. Maybe she recognized a driver she'd seen during her volunteer work at the community center. Whatever she saw, Pope couldn't risk exposure. He or someone under his direction offered her a ride, intending to silence her. Nash, the expendable seasonal hire, became the perfect scapegoat. When conscience or fear drove him to flee, Pope ensured his suicide appeared self-inflicted. The antifreeze deaths, the falsified logs, the silence all converged into a design executed by a man who understood how snow erased sins. On a frozen morning in December 2019, the city held a memorial service outside the renovated bus stop. Police officers, teachers, and former students gathered as Detective Jensen placed a small red scarf over the new plaque. Hensley, white-haired and leaning on a cane, stood beside her. "You gave her back to us," he said quietly. Jensen shook her head. "No, she never really left. The city just stopped listening." Behind them, buses hissed on salted pavement, commuters boarding without looking up. The snow began to fall again, soft, endless, covering footprints before they could form. The official report closed with a single paragraph. Case solved by forensic reanalysis and recovered remains, January 2020. Primary perpetrator deceased. Secondary suspect deceased. Victim identified and returned to next of kin. No further action. But in the evidence locker, Jensen kept one item that didn't fit any category. The carved truck door panel bearing JLW 119. She refused to archive it. When colleagues asked why, she said it was proof that ghosts could write back. Years later, when new recruits studied the Whitaker file in cold case training, instructors emphasized its lessons about environmental evidence and bureaucratic blindness. Yet among Lansing residents, the legend evolved differently. They said the bus stop never froze over now, not even in the coldest January. They said sometimes if you waited long enough, you could hear the faint hum of an old engine and a woman's voice whispering through the snow, counting minutes that no longer passed. 10, 11, 12, still waiting for a bus that would never arrive. The official closure of the Whitaker case did not bring the calm Detective Clara Jensen expected. The morning after the department released its final report, she woke to find her inbox flooded with emails from retired employees, anonymous tips, and journalists who had once covered the case. Most messages offered condolences or congratulations, but a few hinted at unfinished business, files gone missing from the original 1999 investigation, secondary witnesses who had never been interviewed, and whispers of another woman who vanished that same winter. Jensen tried to ignore them at first, but unease persisted. Something about the speed of the city's desire for closure felt off, like a page turned too quickly before the ink had dried. 3 weeks later, while cataloging the recovered evidence for transfer to state archives, Jensen noticed a discrepancy. The chain of custody log listed 38 student essays from Janet's tote bag, but only 37 were in the sealed envelope. The missing one, according to the inventory note written by Hensley in 1999, bore the name Allison Merrick, a student who had since moved out of state. When Jensen tracked her down, Allison, now 40, sounded startled to be reminded of the name. "I remember that essay," she said over the phone. "It was about loyalty. Ms. Whitaker told me it was beautifully sad. She asked to keep it a little longer, said it made her think of something she couldn't explain." Allison paused, then added, "She looked scared that week, not panicked, just watchful." Jensen requested Allison scan any old correspondence she might have kept. 2 days later, an email arrived with a photograph of a note folded among high school memorabilia. "If anything happens, tell them it started at Northline." They watched the snow melt. The handwriting matched Janet's. Jensen's pulse quickened. The note predated the disappearance by at least a day. It suggested Janet had been aware of Northline's illegal operations before that night. She forwarded the evidence to the prosecutor's office, but they dismissed its legal relevance. Primary suspects were dead, the case closed. Still, Jensen felt an obligation to understand what Janet had meant. She revisited the Northline facility, now slated for demolition, accompanied by forensic consultant Daniel Shu. Inside the cold storage bay where Janet's remains had been found, workers had stacked barrels of sealed documents unearthed from a collapsed office. The papers were frozen together in blocks of ice and chemical residue. Shu proposed a controlled thaw at the lab. Among the recovered pages, Jensen found maintenance invoices, vehicle logs, and one spiral-bound notebook labeled GP Incident Reports. The entries were sporadic, scrawled in heavy ink. Most detailed routine accidents, equipment failures, plow collisions, but one, dated January 15, 1999, stopped her cold. Truck 342, unregistered cargo delivered after hours. Witness observed. Handled personally. Ensure silence. The signature beneath was unmistakably Gerald Pope's. The discovery should have confirmed the official narrative, but Jensen's instincts caught on one word: witness. Not victim, not accident, witness. That implied someone else had been present during Janet's encounter, someone who had seen what Pope did and survived. Cross-referencing time cards and union rosters, Jensen identified a second seasonal worker listed as riding with Nash on previous routes, a 24-year-old named Caleb Moore. The file noted he'd been terminated in early February for insubordination and substance abuse. There were no follow-up notes. Jensen tracked him through DMV records to a halfway house in Grand Rapids, where staff said he'd left years ago with no forwarding address. They remembered him as quiet, nervous, prone to night terrors about the girl at the bus stop. One counselor had kept a copy of his intake questionnaire. Under the section Describe Recurring Dreams, Moore had written, "Snow falling inside a building." A red scarf tied to a steering wheel, someone humming through the vents. Jensen requested a missing persons check. To her surprise, Caleb Moore had died in 2003, struck by a snowplow while walking along a highway during a blizzard. The driver? Leonard Pierce, the same man whose suicide had closed one of Hensley's most troubling loops. The coincidence aligned too neatly to be chance. Jensen pulled Pierce's autopsy file from archives and discovered subtle anomalies. A bruise on the wrist, a broken thumbnail consistent with restraint, neither mentioned in the official summary. The coroner had retired in 2001. His replacement reviewed the photos and agreed the injuries didn't fit drowning. It was possible Pierce had been unconscious when submerged. Jensen saw the emerging pattern. Pope's cleanup extended beyond Janet and Nash. Everyone who might have known pieces of the story died within 5 years, each death wrapped in snow. Her investigation became an obsession mirroring Hensley's decades earlier. She worked after hours, filling her office walls with overlapping maps of Lansing's utility grids, truck routes, and Northline's contracted zones. Red string-connected dates, death reports, weather logs. The web formed a rough circle around the Harrison Avenue depot. Within it, 8 unexplained workplace accidents occurred between 1997 and 2001, all during severe winter storms, all involving maintenance employees linked to Pope's unit. Each case documented antifreeze exposure or chemical inhalation. None were prosecuted. Jensen suspected the disposal ring had operated longer than anyone admitted, using the storms as cover for illegal dumps and the occasional accident to silence dissent. Janet's mistake had been curiosity coupled with conscience. In December 2020, while reviewing the digitized police call logs from that week in 1999, Jensen found a single line flagged as transmission error at 10:19 p.m., exactly when Arthur Bell saw the truck. The line contained faint static followed by a woman's voice. "This is Route 7. He's not," before cutting out. Analysts enhanced the audio. Beneath the interference was the hum of an idling diesel engine. The frequency matched city maintenance radios. Janet had used her portable classroom radio, the kind teachers carried for field supervision, to try to contact help when she realized the bus wasn't coming. Dispatch never received the message because of system overlap with municipal channels. Her voice had literally been lost in the noise of city maintenance. The revelation broke something in Jensen. She drove to the bus stop that night despite warnings of another approaching storm. The sky was low, snow heavy. She parked across the street and stood where Janet had stood 2 decades earlier. The streetlight buzzed faintly, haloed by snowflakes. Through the blur of white, she could just make out the outline of the depot fence. Her breath crystallized. For a moment she imagined the hiss of an old engine, the grind of a truck shifting gears, and a woman's faint humming carried by the wind. It wasn't fear she felt then, but an overwhelming sense of unfinished conversation. 2 months later, Jensen presented her full findings in an internal report titled Echo Patterns, Systemic Concealment in the Whitaker Case and Associated Deaths. It ran 312 pages, tracing every connection from Pope's contracts to Pierce's falsified suicide, arguing that at least 4 additional deaths were orchestrated to protect the Northline disposal ring. The department reviewed it, praised her diligence, and quietly sealed the file citing lack of prosecutorial value. When she protested, superiors reminded her the key figures were dead, and that reopening would expose the city to civil liability for decades of negligence. The mayor's office issued a brief statement honoring the dedicated officers who finally brought closure to the Whitaker family. Closure had become the city's word for forgetting. Jensen refused to let it end there. In 2021, she began corresponding with investigative journalist Dana Klein, known for exposing municipal corruption in Flint's water crisis. Together, they planned a long-form documentary titled The Silence Route. Klein filed public records requests, uncovering hundreds of withheld documents, including budget memos approving overtime payments to Pope's department signed by a deputy mayor who later became a state senator. The implication was explosive. The city's highest offices had benefited from Northline's illegal contracts. Before publication, however, the journalist's laptop was stolen from her car. The draft disappeared, backup drives wiped by malware. Jensen took it as proof they were close to something larger. When spring came, she visited Lorraine Whitaker for the last time. The old woman lived in assisted care, mind slipping between clarity and reverie. She recognized Jensen, but called her the humming girl. On the nightstand sat Janet's restored locket and a portable radio tuned to static. "She used to hum when she was nervous," Lorraine said, eyes distant. "It wasn't a song, just her way of keeping time. I think she knew time was running out." Jensen asked if Janet ever mentioned the maintenance yard. Lorraine nodded slowly. She said the trucks ran even when the snow stopped. Said they were cleaning something that wasn't streets. That summer, the Harrison Avenue depot was demolished to make way for new condominiums. Construction crews unearthed another sealed tank beneath the concrete, this one empty except for rusted shackles bolted to the floor. Environmental officials dismissed it as leftover equipment. Jensen watched the broadcast from her apartment, a glass of whiskey sweating beside the laptop. She knew she should move on. Instead, she reopened her copy of Echo Patterns and began drafting a postscript. When a city builds over its secrets, the ground remembers. Snow melts, but silence endures. She resigned from the department the following fall, citing burnout, though those who knew her suspected deeper reasons. In interviews years later, she described hearing the hum again whenever snow fell heavily, the same low vibration that preceded radio interference on the lost transmission. "It's not haunting," she told a podcast host. "It's continuity." The storm that night never stopped. It just spread thinner until we called it weather. By 2025, the Silence Route finally premiered online, reconstructed from Jensen's notes and leaked documents. The documentary ignited outrage across Michigan. Viewers learned that multiple city administrations had buried internal audits linking Northline to contamination of local groundwater. The same de-icer compound found on Janet's tote appeared in soil tests near several schools. Lawsuits followed, settlements quietly reached. The mayor announced a memorial scholarship in Janet Whitaker's name for students pursuing environmental law. Public relations framed it as healing. But for Jensen, it was another layer of snow, soft, concealing, temporary. Every January, she still drives to Lansing, parks near where the bus stop once stood, and listens. The neighborhood has changed, cafes, condominiums. Electric buses gliding silently. But when the first snow thickens and streetlights flicker, she swears she can hear it. The hum beneath the city, a red scarf twisting in memory's wind, and the faintest trace of a woman's voice whispering through static. 10, 11, 12, still counting the minutes that disappeared with her. By the winter of 2026, snow had returned to Lansing with the same indifferent rhythm that always followed scandal and cleanup. The news had long moved on from the silence route, replaced by fresher crises, new investigations, a rotating cycle of outrage and fatigue. For a while, former detective, Clara Jensen thought she could live outside the story. She moved west to a smaller town, taught part-time courses in criminal forensics at a community college, and avoided interviews. But every January she found herself restless, unable to sleep, drawn back to old files saved on encrypted drives, photographs of Harrison Avenue, spectral shapes in headlights, the carved truck door bearing JLW 119. She told herself it was research for a book, but even she didn't believe that. It was an unfinished conversation that still whispered whenever the air turned brittle. The first sign that the past wasn't done came in an unmarked envelope delivered to her mailbox during a freezing rainstorm. No return address, just a USB stick wrapped in paper that smelled faintly of mildew and diesel. The note inside read, "For the humming girl. Listen at night." Jensen hesitated for hours before connecting it to an isolated laptop. The drive contained a single audio file, time-stamped January 18, 1999, 10:27 p.m., and labeled Dispatch Archive 37C. The waveform showed a brief burst of static. Then a woman's voice distorted by interference. "This is Route 7. He's not who..." Followed by a sharp metallic sound and a man's breath close to the microphone. Then silence, 30 seconds of low hum, and faintly, at the end, a second voice she didn't recognize saying, "She saw too much." Jensen froze. The recording was longer than the truncated log preserved in the case file. Someone had edited it before archiving, someone in authority. She contacted Dana Klein, who had continued independent research despite official pressure. Klein traced the file's metadata and confirmed it came from a recently declassified batch of emergency communication tapes released by the State Transportation Board. The fact that it was mailed directly to Jensen meant someone inside wanted her to hear it. Together, they began reconstructing the chain of custody. The dispatch system in 1999 had been analog. Transmissions were recorded on magnetic reels, later digitized in 2005 by a contractor called Silverson Data Systems, a subsidiary of Northline. The company dissolved in 2010 after a federal investigation into environmental fraud, but its records had been stored in a warehouse now under state ownership. When Jensen and Klein requested access, the clerk responded that most reels had been damaged in a flood. They insisted on viewing the inventory anyway. The building smelled of rust and paper rot. In the back room, among warped shelves, they found one box marked Lansing Transit, Jan 1999. Inside lay reels labeled sequentially except for a gap: 37A, 37B, 37D. The missing 37C matched the file name on the USB. Whoever mailed the copy had removed it from this warehouse before the flood. The implications were immediate. Someone had kept the original as insurance. Jensen suspected the whistleblower might be a surviving member of Pope's old crew. Her search led to a man named Evan Rourke, former city technician who'd filed a workers' compensation claim in 2000 citing chemical burns. He was 70 now, living in a VA home near Battle Creek. When Jensen mentioned Northline, his eyes clouded. "That name still buys silence," he said. "We dumped more than snow that winter." People disappeared. He admitted he'd saved a reel as protection. "They took care of anyone who asked questions. I mailed it to you because you already broke the story. I figured if you vanish too, people will notice this time." Before Jensen could ask more, Rourke's nurse entered. When she returned next day, he'd died overnight of respiratory failure. She and Klein brought the extended recording to an audio lab for spectral analysis. The technicians filtered layers of static until background noises emerged: the hum of a diesel engine, the faint whine of hydraulic pumps. Then, beneath Janet's interrupted plea, a second female voice whispering something indecipherable, possibly a name. When amplified, it sounded like Caleb. The presence of a second voice contradicted the theory that Janet had been alone. Klein proposed that the passenger might have been the missing seasonal worker, terrified but alive during the abduction. If so, the recording captured not just a murder but a cover-up in progress, proof that two victims had entered that truck. Jensen tried to submit the new evidence to the state cold case board. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. Officials listened politely, then reminded her that chain of custody was compromised, suspects deceased, and statute of limitations void for ancillary crimes. One commissioner leaned forward and said, "Sometimes closure means protecting the living." That phrase echoed the justification she'd heard years earlier. She left the hearing feeling the same cold she'd felt standing at the bus stop, indifferent, mechanical, vast. Klein released the tape online anyway. Within 24 hours it went viral, shared across true crime forums, dissected by amateur analysts. Listeners claimed to hear background phrases: "Turn it off," "She's bleeding," "Pope will fix it." Whether those were real or products of imagination didn't matter. The story reignited national fascination. News crews returned to Lansing, filming snow swirling over new pavement where the depot once stood. Lorraine Whitaker, now bedridden, died that February without knowing her daughter's final words had been heard by millions. At her funeral, Jensen laid the original red scarf, cleaned, preserved, across the casket. Public reaction forced the state attorney general to announce a limited inquiry. Investigators reviewed Jensen's documentation and unearthed one final twist. Among Northline's financial ledgers was a recurring payment to a consulting firm owned by the same deputy mayor who had approved Pope's contracts. The firm specialized in data management, including emergency communication storage. The deletion of Dispatch 37C had been ordered the week after Janet's disappearance. The deputy mayor, still serving as a state senator, denied involvement, calling it a clerical misunderstanding. The inquiry stalled in procedural deadlock. That summer, Klein's apartment was broken into. Her computers were untouched, but hard drives containing raw audio files were missing. She went into hiding, communicating with Jensen only through encrypted channels. One night in July, she sent a message: "They're still operating. Same chemicals, different name. Follow the truck south." Then her line went dark. Police later found her car abandoned near the Ohio border, engine running, driver's door open. Inside lay a single glove, city maintenance issue, modern model. The resemblance to the 1999 evidence was unmistakable. For weeks, Jensen refused to believe Klein was gone. She retraced every lead, drove miles of highway, and finally found what she was meant to see: new municipal contracts between Lansing and a private logistics company handling winter road safety. Solutions. The company's registration, traced through a labyrinth of shell entities to the same address once used by Northline. The logo on their trucks, white on blue, featured a stylized snowflake wrapped around a gear. She followed one convoy out of the city during a snowstorm and filmed as it turned onto a restricted road leading to an industrial park surrounded by chain-link fences. Through falling snow, she recognized the outline of the same maintenance depot demolished years ago, rebuilt under another name. The ghost had simply changed uniforms. She didn't go public immediately. Instead, she began recording her own log entries, spoken into an old dictaphone she kept from her detective days. Each night, she detailed her movements, the trucks she followed, the faces she saw reflected in rearview mirrors. The tone grew increasingly detached, half documentation, half confession. "They've learned from the past," one entry said. "No more loose ends, no more paper. The snow erases everything except sound." By early 2027, Jensen vanished. Neighbors reported seeing her car parked outside her apartment for 3 days before police entered and found the rooms undisturbed. Coffee mug half full, thermostat set to 68, radio tuned to static. On the table lay her last notebook, a single sentence written in pen. "She's waiting for the bus." The investigation into her disappearance yielded nothing. Her phone was never recovered, and security cameras on her street had been offline due to weather-related outages. Months later, during routine maintenance of the new transit hub on Harrison Avenue, a technician discovered a small envelope taped beneath the bench at the bus shelter. Inside was a micro SD card containing several audio files labeled sequentially, Silenceville 1 through Silence 12. Each captured ambient sounds of snow, distant engines, faint humming. The final recording ended with Jensen's voice whispering, 10, 11, 12. Experts could not determine when or where the audio was made. The city issued a statement calling it a cruel hoax, but those who listened claimed they could hear 2 distinct breaths at the end, one deep and tired, one soft and familiar, overlapping in the cold. Every January, when the snow thickens and the buses run late, residents say radios across Lansing crackle with interference. Dispatchers hear a woman's voice cutting through static. "This is Route 7. And then the hum returns, steady as the storm, a reminder that silence in this city was never absence, only endurance. By the winter of 2028, Lansing had learned to live with its ghosts. The city council had transformed the old Harrison Avenue depot site into a memorial garden, a shallow plaza paved with white granite, engraved with the names of victims from the North Line investigation, Janet Whitaker, Caleb Moore, Leonard Pierce, and unofficially Clara Jensen. At the center stood a sculpture shaped like a frozen wave of wind-carved steel, illuminated from below so that in heavy snow it shimmered faintly, almost breathing. Officials called it the Silence Monument. Reporters called it a public relations gesture. Locals, depending on who you asked, said it was the only place in the city where you could still hear humming when the wind hit the right direction. 2 years had passed since Jensen's disappearance. No body, no car, no trace. Only that last audio file and her sentence scrawled on the notepad. Her apartment had been sealed, then quietly cleared. But a junior archivist named Leah Price, who had once assisted Jensen with cold case records, refused to let the file rest. Price was 27, analytical and unassuming, the kind of civil servant who spoke rarely but noticed everything. When the Archives Division received a new batch of digital transfers from the State Evidence Repository, she recognized a familiar code on one of the drives, CGen Private. It had been mislabeled as personal research and slated for deletion. She copied it onto her own machine, intending to review it before the system purged it. What she found rewrote everything she thought she knew about the case, and about Jensen herself. The folder contained dozens of encrypted audio logs, video clips, and GPS data. It took Price weeks to decode them. Each entry corresponded to one of Jensen's final nights following the unmarked trucks. She had tagged their routes, noting license plates, timestamps, and atmospheric readings. The logs showed that the vehicles didn't merely transport de-icer. They visited sites with high groundwater contamination levels, dumping fluid into underground drains that connected to the river system. The trucks were part of a larger operation rebranded as Coldstream Environmental Services. Cross-referencing corporate filings, Price discovered that Coldstream's parent company was registered in Delaware under the same law firm that had defended Northline 2 decades earlier. Then came the final file, a body cam video, time-stamped February 4, 2027, the night Jensen vanished. The footage opened with the rhythmic sweep of wipers and her voice narrating in a whisper. Following convoy south on Route 127, snow thick. 3 vehicles, no identifiers except reflective hazard triangles. Engine noise consistent with diesel 6-liter models, city maintenance type. Her tone was calm, professional. At 22:47, she said, turning off onto restricted access road. Coordinates uploaded. The headlights illuminated chain-link fences rimmed with frost, then a sign half buried in snow. Coldstream property, authorized personnel only. The trucks ahead slowed, brake lights glowing red through the whiteout. Jensen parked 100 yards behind. Wind speed 30 knots. Visibility minimal, she recorded. There's a secondary structure, storage dome. They're unloading something. The camera zoomed through swirling snow. Figures in reflective gear moved under floodlights, rolling drums from the trucks into a hatch built into the ground. Steam rose from vents. Chemical vapor, Jensen said. Smells like glycol. She stepped closer, the crunch of boots muffled by wind. Suddenly the frame jolted. A shadow crossed the lens. Someone had approached from behind. A male voice, faint under the roar of snow, said, "You shouldn't be here." Then the video fractured into static. For 10 seconds there was only the hum, identical to the one that haunted every recording from the Whitaker case. When the picture returned, the camera was lying sideways in snow, pointing at the sky. A single truck headlight filled the frame before the feed ended. Price sat frozen for nearly an hour, watching the footage again and again. It explained nothing, yet confirmed everything, the continuity Jensen had spoken of, the hum as both literal and symbolic. She packaged the file and took it to her supervisor, who told her quietly to forget it. There are people who still have careers tied to that story, he warned. She knew the risks. Price didn't sleep that night. The next morning she made 3 copies, one for a secure cloud drive, one mailed anonymously to Klein's newsroom, and one hidden inside the archives, misfiled under Meteorological Reports 1999. Then she resigned. That spring, The Silence Route. Aftermath premiered online, incorporating the recovered footage. Viewers watched Jensen's final moments as snow and static merged into one indistinguishable blur. The video went viral again, drawing millions of views, spawning countless theories, some claiming she'd been abducted, others that she'd staged her own disappearance as protest. But among all the speculation, one frame drew particular attention. Just before the shadow crossed her camera, the lens captured a faint symbol stenciled on a drum lid, a snowflake wrapped around a gear. It was the Coldstream logo. The company denied involvement, stating the video was fabricated for entertainment. Days later, their website vanished, replaced by a single blank page that read, "Service temporarily unavailable." Despite official denials, the story ignited a second wave of investigations. Independent scientists sampled runoff near the old depot site and found traces of ethylene glycol and industrial solvents identical to those from the Northline era. A class action lawsuit followed, accusing the city of perpetuating environmental crimes under new branding. The case dragged through courts, delayed by procedural tactics, but public faith in municipal transparency never recovered. Every winter, whenever snowplows rolled through downtown, residents filmed them, fearful that history was repeating itself. Meanwhile, odd things began happening around the Memorial Garden. Maintenance workers reported hearing faint radio interference from their walkie-talkies near the sculpture, static resolving briefly into the words, Route 7. Late at night, passing buses triggered motion sensors that shouldn't have been active, their onboard radios flickering with ghost transmissions. An engineer who serviced the electrical system swore he heard 2 overlapping voices humming through the cables, one steady, one slightly off-key. He quit the next day. Leah Price tried to ignore the rumors until one evening she decided to visit the garden herself. Snow fell softly, muffling the city's usual hum. She stood before the steel wave and switched on her phone's recorder. "If you can hear me," she whispered, "I found your files. They know you were right." For a few seconds there was only the sound of wind. Then her phone speaker crackled, a low tone swelling into the unmistakable rhythm of breath through static. And then, a faint reply, fragile but unmistakable, another woman's voice humming 3 notes, the same phrase Janet Whitaker used to calm her students before tests. Price's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said. When she played the recording later, the hum was gone, replaced by a soft mechanical whir, as if a distant engine idled somewhere beyond memory. By 2029, the city's geography had changed again. The Harrison Avenue corridor became part of a new transit line, electric and silent. The Memorial Garden remained, its lights flickering during storms. Reporters occasionally returned for anniversary segments, 25 years since the bus stop disappearance. They told the story of the teacher whose footprints ended in snow, the detective who refused to let the trail fade, and the whistleblower who gave her life for the truth. But over time, even those reports grew shorter, condensed into sound bites. Yet for those who lived nearby, the legend endured. Residents claimed that on certain nights, when the snow comes sideways and the buses halt from ice, a figure in a red scarf appears at the shelter. She waits patiently, breath fogging, her outline illuminated by the LED streetlight. Drivers who pass swear she lifts her hand as if to wave them down, then vanishes when they brake. Others say that if you stand quietly, you'll hear the low murmur of two women conversing, a teacher and a detective, finally meeting at last stop, their voices blending into the hum of a diesel engine that hasn't run in decades. In a sense, Lansing kept its promise of silence. The lawsuits settled quietly. No officials went to prison, but the story refused to die. University students wrote theses about the silence effect, studying how collective guilt seeps into urban folklore. Podcasters debated whether Jensen's final video was real or staged. One anonymous caller left a message during a live broadcast claiming to have worked for Coldstream's replacement company. His voice shook as he said, "They never stopped. They just changed the color of the trucks." The call disconnected before hosts could trace it. On the 30th anniversary, the city unveiled a new plaque beneath the memorial sculpture. It bore no official seal, no sponsor, just a simple inscription, for those who waited in the storm and for those who listened. Justice delayed is still an echo. May the hum remind us what we chose not to hear. That night, snow began to fall heavier than it had in years. Power flickered, buses stalled, radios filled with static. At 10:19 p.m., the exact minute Janet's transmission had first broken through in 1999, dispatchers across multiple counties reported interference on all frequencies. Amid the static, a woman's voice came through clearly for the first time in 30 years. "This is Route 7. He's not who you think." The snow is falling inside. Then silence returned, deep and endless. In the days that followed, technicians found no evidence of the broadcast. Official reports cited atmospheric anomalies, but those who'd heard it recognized the voice, steady, calm, faintly humming. Not Janet's, not Jensen's. Something older, a composite echo of both. They said the storm carried it from the river north through the city and out into the dark farmland beyond, where footprints vanish before dawn. And sometimes, when the winter air stills and the lights of Lansing shimmer against low clouds, commuters waiting for the late bus on Harrison Avenue swear the air vibrates faintly beneath their feet. A hum, a heartbeat, the sound of a story refusing to end. Epilogue, Addendum, Cold Case Division Report 2029. Subject, Whitaker, Jensen Files. Status, Closed Summary. All material evidence secured, recordings archived. Public inquiry deemed inconclusive. Unverified transmissions continue to be reported during severe winter storms. Recommendation, maintain monitoring protocol for atmospheric interference around memorial site. Officer's note, handwritten, sometimes the snow isn't erasing, it's preserving. Every flake another word of a story the city keeps trying to forget. And in the static between channels beneath the endless Michigan snow, that story hums on, eternal, unresolved, waiting for the next listener to answer.